What happens when you tell a black woman to give up her first-class seat to make room for a white passenger who wants it? What if you have her moved to the back of the plane, simply because someone with money and status decided they deserved her spot better? You might get away with it. You might even feel powerful. Unless that woman isn't just another traveler. Unless she's the one who signs every paycheck. Unless she owns the entire airline. Keisha Morrison stood in her Dallas office on a Tuesday morning, looking out at the Texas skyline, and felt the weight of that question pressing down on her shoulders with a force that made it hard to breathe. She was by any metric one of the most powerful women in the aviation industry. As the chief executive officer of Horizon Airways, she controlled a fleet of 920 aircraft, a workforce of 87,000 employees, and a multi-billion-dollar budget that made her decisions matter to millions of people every single day. Her face had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune. Her keynote speeches on logistics and market disruption were standing room only. She had built her father's The Small Regional Airline into a global powerhouse. But lately she felt like she was presiding over something rotting from the inside. The financial reports were solid. The stock price was stable. But the customer satisfaction scores, they were plummeting like a plane in a nosedive. The reports landing on her desk told a story of two different airlines existing under the same name. One was the high-gloss luxury brand she marketed to the world. The other was a crumbling infrastructure of employee resentment, cultural bias, and a dangerous obsession with status over safety and service. The complaints were ugly. Passengers of color reported being passed over for upgrades. Muslim passengers reported random security checks at the gate far too often to be random. And a disturbing number of reports mentioned a culture of entitlement among the senior flight crews who saved the best service for passengers in the platinum executive tier while treating standard economy passengers with disdain. Some complaints described being treated like they didn't belong in their assigned seats. Some described being moved without consent. Some described being humiliated in front of other passengers. Keisha thought about her father, James Morrison, who had founded Horizon Airways 40 years ago, with a simple philosophy. We fly people, not status points. He said it so many times that it became company scripture. But somewhere along the way, the scripture had been forgotten. Somewhere along the way, profit had replaced principle. She had taken his small company and made it a global giant. But she feared she had lost its soul in the process. That morning, Keisha made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't fix what she didn't fully understand. She couldn't dismantle a problem she only knew through reports and statistics. She needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed to feel it in her own bones. She needed to experience her own company the way a regular passenger experienced it. She needed to walk through her own airline as nobody and understand what her own people had become. So she was going to go undercover. Not like the reality TV show. No cameras, no drama team, no producers waiting for a confrontation. Just Keisha flying commercial on her own airline, watching everything. She had booked a multi-leg journey under an assumed name, Kelly Price, on her own aircraft. LAX to JFK, then JFK to London, then London back to Dallas. She would fly commercial, check her own bags, and observe. She would document everything. And when she was done, she would burn it all down and rebuild it correctly. She wasn't just tired from work. She was tired from the fight. The old guard on her board of directors, men who had been her father's colleagues, were fighting her modernization efforts at every turn. In the last board meeting, Marcus Thompson, the board's senior member, had actually said to her, "These new age sensitivity trainings are a waste of money, Keisha. You coddle the staff. You spoil the customers. You just need to run the planes on time." She had looked at him with a dangerousness that made him lean back in his chair. "People are the business, Marcus," she had said quietly. "And our people are telling us we're failing them." PR fluff, he'd scoffed. This trip was her ammunition. She wasn't just collecting anecdotes. She was collecting the data to save her father's legacy from the very people who claimed to protect it. She was going to prove that the rot went deeper than anyone wanted to admit. And then she was going to rip it out, root and all. Keisha went to her closet and selected her uniform for the audit simple jeans that had been worn in a grey turtleneck sweater, a pair of nondescript sneakers. She pulled her thick, naturally textured hair back into a simple tight bun and put on wire-rimmed glasses instead of her usual contacts. No makeup, nothing that signaled CEO, nothing that signaled wealth or power or importance. The only item that hinted at her status was the vintage Rolex on her wrist, a watch her father had left her when he passed. But it was discreet enough to be overlooked by someone not specifically looking for it. Good. That was exactly the point. She looked less like a CEO and more like a weary university professor. And that was perfect. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt something twist inside her chest. She felt angry. Not at the people in her company yet, though that was coming. She felt angry at herself for not knowing how bad things had become. She felt angry at her father for trusting her with his legacy, only to watch her lose control of it. She felt angry at a system that had taught her employees that money determined dignity. She touched the mirror and whispered, "I'm coming. And when I'm done, everything changes." LAX Terminal 6 was a cathedral of modern travel. Glass and steel and chrome everywhere. It was beautiful in an impersonal way. Keisha stood in the public departure lounge with her carry-on roller bag and her boarding pass under the name Kelly Price, and she began to observe. The air felt different when you weren't the person in charge. It felt hostile in a way she hadn't expected. The check-in area was chaos, but the chaos had a pattern. At counter number 3, an agent named Marcus Rodriguez was helping a white businessman with an easy smile and warm eye contact. "Good morning, sir. Let me get you checked in right away. First time flying with us?" The businessman smiled back, pleased with the personal attention. His luggage was handled with care. His questions were answered with enthusiasm. At counter number 1, an elderly Asian couple waited for help. When an agent finally came over, a young woman named Rebecca Santos, her greeting was curt. Next, no smile, no eye contact. No, "Can I help you today?" Just efficiency, just the bare minimum. Their luggage was tagged quickly. Their questions were answered in monosyllables. Keisha's hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the difference. She could feel the message being sent to these passengers. You matter less. She watched this play out 3 more times over the next 15 minutes. Warm service for people who looked wealthy. Cordial but distant service for everyone else. She pulled out her phone and opened a locked notes app. LAX T6, counter 1. Agent Rebecca Santos. Dismissive tone, minimal eye contact, clear. Lack of empathy toward older passengers. Needs immediate retraining. Pattern confirmed. Status determines warmth of greeting. Through the window she watched the baggage handlers. One of them, a young Hispanic man, carefully placed each piece of luggage on the conveyor belt. He treated the bags like they mattered. He treated the luggage like it belonged to people he cared about. But then she watched another handler, this one white, grab a delicate-looking roller bag and fling it onto the belt with such force that Keisha actually winced and gasped aloud. She recognized that bag. It was hers. Her hands clenched into fists. She forced them to relax. She was still breathing hard. She thought about all the passengers who had filled out complaint forms about damaged luggage. She thought about how many of those complaints had probably been from passengers of color. She thought about how many times she had read those complaints in a boardroom and not actually done anything about them. Not yet. Observe first, respond later. But feel it. Let yourself feel it. The gate area showed her more of the same story. She watched a platinum executive line begin to form a self-important huddle of people who had already been pre-boarding for 10 minutes while everyone else waited. A woman at the front of the line, dripping in gold jewelry and wearing sunglasses indoors, was tapping her foot impatiently like she was commanding an army. Her name, according to her boarding pass, that Keisha could see from a distance, was Victoria Ashford. Keisha noted, "Pre-boarding privilege creates unnecessary tension and inequality perception among passengers." Message sent. Some people are worth waiting for, others are not. Then she watched as a gate agent, Jennifer Walsh, snapped at an elderly Hispanic couple who asked a simple question about boarding zones. "Just wait for your zone to be called." "Jennifer," said her voice sharp enough to cut through bone. The couple exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't done anything wrong. They had simply asked for clarification. They didn't deserve to be spoken to like they were inconveniencing her, like they were beneath her. But Jennifer had already moved on, attending to the next passenger in line, a young white man in an expensive suit. Suddenly her voice changed completely. "Good morning. Welcome to Horizon Airways. How are we doing today?" Her smile was warm. Her tone was inviting. She had completely transformed into a different person. The contrast was stark, brutal, undeniable. Keisha felt something dark and hot rise in her chest. She wanted to walk over and ask Jennifer Walsh why she believed some people deserved kindness and others deserved coldness. She wanted to ask her when she had decided that a person's worth was determined by their appearance and their confidence. She wanted to ask her if she realized what message she was sending to every person who saw her treatment differently. But she didn't. She just noted everything in her phone. Now, as she walked toward the gate area, she decided to step into the Horizon Elite Lounge. Platinum members only. She wasn't platinum, but she had a manager's pass from years ago that she kept in her wallet. The lounge attendant barely glanced at it before waving her through. He was more focused on the woman ahead of her, Victoria Ashford. The lounge was everything the public waiting area wasn't. Real leather chairs, fresh flowers, an open bar with champagne that was actually Dom Perignon, waitstaff circulating with hot appetizers. It was beautiful. It was exclusive. It was a physical manifestation of the message, "You matter more than other people. Your comfort is worth more than their dignity." Keisha watched as Victoria Ashford commanded the room from a corner table, her voice carrying across the hushed space. "And I told him," she announced to her husband Richard, who was already on a work call, "and not listening. If that imbecile at Covington Capital can't close the Singapore deal, you fire him. You fire his entire family." She laughed, a sharp barking sound that made Keisha's jaw tighten with barely suppressed anger. A lounge attendant, Miguel Fernandez, rushed over with a fresh champagne flute. "Mrs. Ashford, another glass of Dom Perignon." "Is it real champagne?" Victoria asked, her voice dripping with contempt and cruelty. "Or is it that dreadful Prosecco you tried to pass off on me last time?" "The real thing," Mrs. Ashford Miguel assured her quickly, his face flushing with humiliation. "The Dom Perignon, as requested." Meanwhile, a middle-aged black businessman sat 3 tables away. He had been waiting for service for 20 minutes. He had finally raised his hand tentatively. A different lounge attendant saw him, nodded, and then did nothing. Just continued walking past like he didn't exist. Keisha felt her entire body go rigid. She understood in that moment what her own company had become. She understood what culture had been built while she wasn't paying attention. She understood that her company had created a place where some people were visible and others were invisible. And the determining factor wasn't their loyalty or their kindness or their character. It was their money. It was their status. It was their race. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would have said if he could see this. She thought about the look on his face. She left the lounge and returned to the gate area. Her phone buzzed with a notification, MA8227 to JFK, now boarding first class seat 5A. She pulled up her boarding pass and confirmed. Seat 5A, window seat, her favorite. She had no idea that her name, Kelly Price, was about to become the center of a storm that would ripple through her entire company and beyond. Derek Walsh was having what he believed was a good day. At least he thought he was. The 34-year-old flight attendant had been working for Horizon Airways for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had learned something very important. Power feels good. The uniform gave him a tiny slice of authority, and he had learned to wield it like a freshly sharpened weapon. Derek wasn't always bitter, but 6 years of being passed over for promotion twice, in fact, had a way of souring a person from the inside out. He'd been passed over for the purser position twice, and both times the person who got it was someone from the new diversity initiative. Derek didn't frame it that way to himself, of course. He told himself it was about merit. He told himself the system was unfair. He told himself a lot of things that made the bitterness feel justified and righteous. What he didn't tell himself was the truth he'd chosen resentment as his identity. He'd decided that because he wasn't getting what he wanted, the entire system must be rigged against him. And once you decide that it's easy to justify anything, he checked the passenger manifest for flight MA8227 as he stood near the gate counter. His eyes scanned the names, calculating. This was a game he'd gotten good at over 6 years. Platinum passengers who might be impressed by extra attention and could potentially give him good reviews. Non-status passengers who could be ignored or even subtly disrespected if needed. Somewhere in the back of his mind he knew this wasn't right. Somewhere in the back of his mind he understood he was choosing to become someone small and cruel. But that voice was easy to ignore. His eyes landed on a name, Kelly Price, seat 5A. No status, no special requests. Then Richard Ashford, seat 5C, Platinum Elite. Frequent flyer, VIP notes. Then Mrs. R. Ashford, seat 5D, 7-star Platinum Executive Tier. Derek smiled. He knew Richard Ashford. He'd flown with him multiple times. Richard was the kind of passenger who tipped well and demanded the right things. Impress him, and a good word might get back to management. Impress him, and maybe someone would finally notice Derek was overdue for a promotion. Impress him, and maybe this time he'd finally get the purser position. Maybe this time the system would work in his favor. But first, Derek would have to handle the Kelly Price situation. And Derek was very good at making decisions that favored rich people over everyone else. At the gate, Ben Torres was working. Ben was 22, Hispanic, and one of the good ones. He was patiently helping an elderly white couple find their connecting gate information. They were confused about the terminal change and worried they'd missed something important. Ben wasn't in a hurry. He explained everything clearly and with genuine kindness. He made them feel like their questions mattered. Derek watched this unfold and felt irritation spike in his chest like a fever. He strode over and grabbed Ben by the arm, pulling him away from the elderly couple. "Stop coddling the economy cattle and focus on the priority line." Derek snapped, his voice sharp and cutting. "We're behind schedule." Ben's face flushed with humiliation. He felt the eyes of nearby passengers on him. He felt the weight of being told publicly that he was doing something wrong by being kind. But it was worse than that. It was being told that kindness was inefficient, that treating people with respect was coddling, that his choice to see every passenger as a human being who deserved courtesy was somehow wrong. Ben looked at the elderly couple he'd been helping. They looked back at him with embarrassment, as if his kindness had somehow put them in an awkward position, as if they had inconvenienced him by needing help. "I was just—" Ben started. "Do your job." Derek cut him off coldly, his voice louder now so everyone could hear that he was the one with authority. Derek released Ben's arm with a small shove and turned toward the first-class line with a practiced smile. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." Ben stood there for a long moment, his face still burning. He wanted to say something back. He wanted to stand up for the elderly couple. He wanted to stand up for himself. But he was 22, and Derek was authority, so Ben just nodded and helped the elderly couple get their information. What Ben didn't understand yet, but would understand a year from now when he was teaching flight crews how to see passengers as people, was that Derek's cruelty had planted a seed in him. Not a seed of resentment, but a seed of clarity. In that moment, Ben had learned exactly the kind of person he didn't want to become. Meanwhile, in the Horizon Elite Lounge, Victoria Ashford was holding court in a way that had become second nature to her. Victoria had not been born rich. This was important to understand. She had married into wealth. She had married Richard Ashford 28 years ago when he was already rising through the ranks of Covington Capital, and she had learned quickly that in his world status was currency. Wealth was oxygen. And being treated as special, being treated as if she mattered more than other people, was the only thing that made her feel like she had actual value. Her entire identity had become calcified around her 7-star platinum status. It wasn't just a status. It was her identity. It was the thing that made her Victoria. Without it, who was she? Just another woman. Just another face in the crowd. The thought terrified her in a way she would never admit to anyone. She had been wearing the same Horizon Elite bracelet for 3 years. She had memorized the names of 6 crew members who always took special care of her. She had learned exactly how to demand things in a way that sounded like a request, but felt like a command. And it worked. Every single time people jumped for her, every single time the world rearranged itself according to her preferences. Until today. A lounge attendant, Chloe Rodriguez, approached with a nervous smile. "Mrs. Ashford, another glass of champagne." "Is it the real champagne or that dreadful Prosecco you tried to pass off on me last time?" Victoria asked, not bothering to look up from her phone where she was messaging her personal trainer about her afternoon session and making plans that assumed her world would remain unchanged. "The Dom Perignon as requested." Chloe assured her quickly. "Fine, and tell the gate agent I want to pre-board. I don't like to mix with the rush." "Of course, Mrs. Ashford. We'll call you personally when it's time." Victoria nodded, satisfied. This was how the world was supposed to work. This was how it had always worked for her. Rich people got to board first. Rich people got the best service. Rich people got to sit in the window seats they preferred. It was the natural order. It was justice. It was simply how things were done. She had no idea that someone was about to teach her that this natural order was actually injustice. She had no idea that someone was about to show her that being treated as special was not a right but a privilege that could be revoked. She had no idea it was going to cost her everything. Richard Ashford, her husband, was already absorbed in a work call in a private booth in the lounge. He was making deals on the phone, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from having made a lot of money and being willing to make more. He wasn't interested in pre-boarding or window seats or any of the things that made Victoria's heart race. He had money, power, authority. Window seats seemed like a small thing compared to the billion-dollar deals he negotiated daily. But he would learn soon enough that sometimes the small things matter more than any deal. Sometimes the way you treat people when you have power is more important than any contract. Derek finished greeting the platinum passengers and turned back to the gate area. He saw a woman in simple clothes, jeans, and a turtleneck moving through the crowd toward the gate. She had a modest carry-on bag and wire-rimmed glasses. She looked like nobody. She looked like exactly the kind of passenger Derek had learned to treat as invisible. He had no way of knowing that this woman was about to change everything. He had no way of knowing that his small cruelties and his choices to prioritize wealth over dignity were about to be exposed to the entire world. Keisha settled into 5A and felt her shoulders relax for the first time all week. Window seat, forwardmost position on the port side. It offered a view of the engine and the wing, and she had always loved watching the physics of flight, the controlled, elegant violence of takeoff. The impossible made possible through engineering and faith, and the belief that people should be treated with dignity. But today, settling into this seat on her own airline, while pretending to be nobody, she felt something else, a quiet anger, a deep rumbling anger that had been building since the moment she watched that gate agent snap at the elderly couple for asking a simple question. This seat should make her feel powerful. Instead, it made her feel like a ghost in her own company. She didn't belong here as Kelly Price, but somehow she didn't quite belong as Keisha Morrison either. Not in a culture that had been corrupted while she wasn't watching. Not in a company her father had built on dignity, and that she had allowed to become a place where dignity was a luxury item available only to the wealthy. She arranged her things carefully, a novel she'd been meaning to read, a bottle of water, her phone on silent. She was taking mental notes, filing away observations about crew behavior, about the way passengers were greeting each other based on perceived status, about the architectural choices that had been made to separate first class from everything else, about how the system had been designed to make some people feel important and everyone else feel small. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She began typing MA8227. Every system on this aircraft has been designed to enforce hierarchy. Every touchpoint tells passengers, you are worth exactly what you paid. This is not an airline. This is a caste system with wings. Derek passed by her seat, barely glancing down. To him, Kelly Price was just another economy passenger who'd somehow ended up in first class through a points redemption. No status, no special notes, nobody important, not worth his time or his charm. Then Victoria Ashford emerged from the galley, and everything changed. She had discovered something that had set her off like a bomb. Kelly Price was sitting in the window seat. Victoria's window seat. The one she always sat in when flying first class. Her husband was in 5C, the aisle seat across the cabin, a completely different section of the row. They weren't even close to sitting together, and that was Victoria's fault, not anyone else's. Her travel agent had confirmed the seats, but Victoria hadn't been paying attention. But in her mind, the math was simple. She wanted the window. This woman had it, and therefore the woman needed to move. It was that simple. It was that basic. Victoria marched down the aisle like she owned it. In her mind, she did. In her mind, her platinum status gave her the right to demand that other people rearrange their lives for her comfort. "Excuse me," Victoria said. Not a question, not a greeting. A demand dressed up as courtesy. "You're in my seat." Keisha looked up from her novel slowly. She took a moment to really see Victoria. The gold jewelry, the designer clothing, the sunglasses still on her face indoors, the sense of entitlement radiating off her like heat waves off hot asphalt. "I'm sorry," Keisha said calmly, her voice steady and controlled. "But I don't believe so. My boarding pass says 5A. Victoria's jaw dropped. She was so accustomed to people capitulating to her demands that the polite but firm no hit her like a physical blow. It had been years since someone had said no to her. Years since she'd experienced resistance from anyone. "I don't care what your pass says." Victoria snapped, her voice loud enough to turn heads in the surrounding rows and make other passengers look up from their phones and their conversations. "I always sit here. My husband is across the aisle. We need this row. You need to move." The sheer unadulterated entitlement of the demand hung in the air, but it also revealed something about Victoria desperation. Under the entitlement was panic. This woman needed this seat, because without it, without the visible markers of her status and privilege, she was afraid she would disappear. Keisha had negotiated billion-dollar contracts with hostile unions and arrogant aircraft manufacturers. She had sat across from board members who actively fought against her vision for the company. She had learned to be patient with unreasonable people, but she had also learned when patience was just another word for enabling. When kindness was just another word for accepting injustice. "Your assigned seat is 5B, Keisha said. pointing to the seat next to hers. "The flight attendant can help you locate it." A passenger in 6A gasped. "That's outrageous," someone said. Other passengers were watching now. Some had phones out. Victoria's face went through several colors: red, then purple, then a sickly pale white. She had not been told no in so long that the word felt foreign. Obscene. Impossible. "I'll get the flight attendant," Victoria announced, spinning on her heel like she was commanding an army. Within 30 seconds, Derek appeared. He had sensed tension, and he had sensed an opportunity. He saw Victoria a 7-star platinum passenger, a woman he recognized, a woman he'd flown with multiple times, a woman who might remember him favorably or unfavorably. And he saw Kelly Price, a nobody, a non-entity, someone whose preferences didn't matter on the cosmic scale of airline operations. His calculation was instant, and it was wrong. It was the wrong calculation for the right reasons. It was wrong because it was cruel. But Derek had learned to justify cruelty by telling himself he was just following the culture. "Ma'am, I'm Derek Walsh, senior flight attendant," he said to Keisha, his voice dripping with false concern and practiced charm. "I'm Derek Walsh. It seems we have a small issue with the seating." Keisha looked at him coolly, her gaze steady and unflinching. "There's no issue. I'm in my assigned seat 5A. This passenger is assigned 5B. She wants my seat. I have declined to move." Derek's plastic smile tightened. This was not the quick, subservient apology he expected. He had expected the woman in jeans to understand the hierarchy. He had expected her to understand that she didn't matter. "I understand, ma'am," Derek said, his voice taking on a patronizing edge, as if he was speaking to a child or someone mentally incapable of understanding simple facts. "But Mrs. Ashford is one of our most valued high-priority flyers. Her husband is in 5C. We need to accommodate their request to sit together." "They are sitting together?" Keisha pointed out calmly, her voice remaining level and reasonable. 5B and 5C are right next to each other. I'm across the aisle in 5A. The only person who isn't sitting next to someone they want to sit with is Mrs. Ashford, who wants my seat. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, but Keisha continued. "The question is why the airline should reward someone for being demanding by violating another passenger's assigned seating rights." The cabin had gone very quiet. Several phones appeared recording. People understood on some level that they were witnessing something important. Derek felt his control slipping away like sand through his fingers. He was used to people folding under pressure. He had built his entire personality on the assumption that he held power and others should submit to it. The experience of being pushed back against was genuinely unsettling. It made him feel small, which made him want to become aggressive. "Mrs. Ashford," Derek said, turning to Victoria with a false smile, "why don't you get comfortable in 5C with your husband, and I'll take 5B. I will handle this situation. I'm not sitting in 5C. Victoria said firmly, her voice cutting through the cabin. "That's Richard's seat. I want 5A. Derek turned back to Keisha, and his eyes had gone cold. The smile was gone. The charm was gone. What remained was an attempt at dominance. "Ma'am, I'm not asking you any more," Derek said, his voice loud and clear enough for the cabin to hear. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the power of the crowd on his side. "As a representative of Horizon Airways, I am instructing you to move. We need to board this flight on schedule." Keisha stood up slowly. She was 5'7", not tall, but in that moment she seemed to tower over the cabin. Every passenger was watching now. Every phone was recording. "On what grounds?" she asked. "On what basis are you instructing a passenger to abandon her paid assigned seat for another passenger's preference? On the grounds of crew instruction for operational necessity?" Derek shot back, his jaw clenched. "What operational necessity requires me to give up my assigned seat for another passenger's preference?" Keisha's voice was quiet, but it had a blade's edge. "Please explain the operational necessity, Mr. Walsh. please explain to everyone in this cabin why I should move." Derek was cornered. He had no actual authority to do this, and he knew it. But backing down now in front of Victoria Ashford and the entire first-class cabin would be a fatal loss of face. He had to double down. He had to commit to the lie completely. "Look," Derek said, his voice hardening. "We have a lovely seat for you in our premium economy cabin. 12F. It's an aisle seat, much roomier. You'll actually prefer it." A passenger in 6A stood up. "That's outrageous. A downgrade?" "She paid for first class." Victoria smirked. The humiliation of a downgrade would be perfect. It would put this woman in her place. It would restore the natural order. It would prove that Victoria still had power. Derek felt the power surging through him again. He had leverage. He had control. He had the uniform and the authority and the backing of a passenger with money and status. He had the backing of a system that had been designed to protect rich people at the expense of everyone else. "This is an order, not a negotiation." Derek said, his voice louder now, more aggressive. "If you refuse to comply with crew instructions, you will be in violation of federal aviation law. I will have you removed from this aircraft. The entire plane will be delayed because of you. Is that what you want?" The threat hung in the air like a guillotine. Derek was betting everything that she would fold, that she would understand finally that she was not his equal. Keisha looked at Derek, then at Victoria, then at the cabin full of passengers watching this unfold. She saw several phones recording. She saw fear on some faces and anger on others. She saw a moment that would define everything that came next. She took a slow, deliberate breath. "So to be perfectly clear," Mr. Walsh, Keisha said, her voice projecting with the practiced clarity of someone used to addressing boardrooms and corporate executives, "you are threatening to deplane a paying passenger from her assigned first-class seat to accommodate the preference of another passenger. And you are attempting to do so by downgrading her as punishment. All based on what exactly?" "Her appearance, her perceived lack of status in your manifest." "The color of her skin," Derek stammered. "I'm not. Get her off the plane." "Thomas," Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with triumph, her confidence restored because she was certain that Derek represented actual authority and actual power. "She's holding us all up. Get security." "One more chance, ma'am," Derek said, pulling himself up straighter, his voice taking on a tone of false finality. "Move, or I call the captain and have you removed." Keisha reached into her carry-on bag slowly. Derek expected her to grab her belongings to move. Other passengers probably expected the same. Maybe Victoria even expected it. Instead, Keisha pulled out a slim black ID card attached to a lanyard. The card was not blue, not the standard crew ID that hung around Derek's neck. It was black, with a Gold Horizon Airways seal. The transformation was instantaneous. Derek's face drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed without sound. His hands started to shake. Captain Nathan Ortega emerged from the cockpit confused about the Code 7 alert. He'd received a code that hadn't been used since 9/11. The alert meant something catastrophic. The alert meant something that threatened the safety of the flight. He saw the black ID card and his face drained of all color. "Miss Morrison." He breathed, his voice shaking with a mixture of shock and something like fear. I didn't know you were boarding this flight." Captain Nathan Ortega was a 55-year-old career military pilot who had seen a lot of things. He had flown through storms that would have terrified most men. He had managed emergencies where lives depended on his decisions. He had handled situations where staying calm was the only thing standing between life and death. But he had never seen anything like this. He understood in that moment what the black ID card meant. He understood that he was looking at a woman with more power than he could imagine. He understood that a CEO was about to dismantle something in real time on his aircraft. He understood that his life was about to change too, because he had a choice to make: stand up or stay silent. The words hit Derek like a bullet to the brain, Miss Morrison. The name hung in the air. Then someone whispered it. Then someone else whispered it. Then a passenger in 6A, the one who had been filming, whispered to his neighbor, "That's Keisha Morrison, the CEO." Within seconds, a dozen phones raised up. Suddenly, this wasn't just a passenger dispute. It was the most important story happening in that cabin. It was about to become the most important story happening on social media. Victoria's face went from victorious to confused to terrified in the span of 3 seconds. Richard Ashford finally took off his headphones and looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Then he saw the ID card. His face went pale. He knew who Keisha Morrison was. Everyone in his world knew who Keisha Morrison was. Richard stood up slowly. His mind went through calculations. He understood instantly that his wife had just done something that couldn't be undone. He understood that he had been sitting in the same cabin while his wife demanded that another passenger be humiliated. He understood that his silence was participation. And he understood that if there were cameras, and there were always cameras now, then his participation was being documented for the entire world to see. He slowly sat back down. Derek looked like he might actually faint. His legs actually trembled, and he reached out to grab the armrest for support. Keisha stood up. The weary professor persona had completely evaporated. What remained was something far more formidable. What remained was a CEO who had caught her own company in the act of discrimination. Her voice when she spoke had changed. It was no longer quiet. It was commanding. It filled the entire cabin like oxygen, like pressure, like the weight of real authority. "Captain Ortega," she said, "thank you for coming out. I am here incognito conducting an undercover service and safety audit on this flight. An audit which I am sad to say this flight has failed spectacularly." She turned her burning gaze onto Derek, and when she did, Derek actually felt his knees weaken. "Mr. Walsh, let me explain what just happened. You saw a woman you deemed without status. You saw a platinum passenger willing to throw her weight around. And instead of enforcing company policy, instead of treating all passengers equally, you bent the rules to appease her. You saw a hierarchy, and you chose to enforce it. You used your authority not for safety, not for service, for discrimination, for the protection of a system that rewards people based on the color of their wallet instead of the content of their character. Derek's mouth was moving, but no words were coming out. You identified me as a passenger with no status. Keisha continued, her voice cutting like a scalpel. You colluded with another passenger, Mrs. Ashford, to have me removed from my paid assigned seat based purely on her preference. When I politely declined, you lied about operational necessity. When I called you on that lie, you escalated. You attempted to downgrade me as punishment. And when I refused to be humiliated, you threatened to have me removed from this aircraft in violation of at least 4 separate FAA regulations and a dozen Horizon Airways corporate policies. She turned to Victoria, and her expression was filled with a cold, profound disappointment. And you, Mrs. Ashford, you who believe your platinum status makes you royalty, you verbally harassed another passenger. You demanded she be moved. You reveled in the idea of her being humiliated and downgraded. You are the living embodiment of the cultural rot I am here to excise from this company. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She was frozen by the realization that her power had been an illusion all along. This person, Keisha said, pointing at Derek, did not invent this system. But he chose to participate in it. He chose to use power over people. He chose to see a passenger without perceived status and decided she was worth less than someone with money. That choice. That's on him. Two security officers in dark suits suddenly appeared at the cabin door. They had been waiting at the jet bridge, ready for what they didn't yet know would happen. Keisha's voice remained controlled, but was now ice-cold. Captain Ortega, Mr. Walsh's employment with Horizon Airways is terminated effective immediately. I am documenting this incident as a violation of federal aviation regulations and company policy. Mr. Walsh will be escorted to an HR holding facility for termination proceedings. Derek was trembling visibly now. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely move. You will collect your personal belongings from the galley. Keisha continued, and there was no mercy in her voice. You will surrender your crew ID to the captain. You will speak to no one about this incident, and you will understand that your career in aviation is very likely finished. She turned to the security officers. Officers, if Mr. Walsh refuses to comply or causes any disturbance, he will be in violation of federal law. Derek unbuckled his crew ID with shaking hands. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. His career had just ended in the span of 3 minutes. Everything he'd built on resentment and cruelty had been torn down by a woman in jeans who had the actual power he'd been pretending to have. He handed the ID to Captain Ortega, who took it with visible sadness. The captain understood what Derek was only beginning to comprehend. He had chosen wrong. In every possible way, he had chosen wrong. Derek stood up on wobbly legs and was flanked by the two security officers. He walked down the aisle of the cabin with everyone watching. Some passengers were still recording. Some were whispering. Some were shaking their heads in disgust at what they had just witnessed. The walk seemed to take forever, and no time at all. When Derek disappeared into the jet bridge, the door closed behind him with finality. The cabin exhaled. Keisha sat back down in 5A. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. But inside, a storm was raging. She had just fired a senior flight attendant on a live plane in front of hundreds of witnesses. She had just dismantled someone's career because he had chosen cruelty over compassion. She had just enforced accountability in a way that would ripple through the entire company and probably through the entire industry. But she wasn't done. Captain Ortega, she said, her voice returning to a slightly more normal register, but losing none of its authority. We need a new purser. Who is the most senior flight attendant currently aboard? There was a pause. Then a woman stepped forward from the galley. That would be me, ma'am, she said. Her name was Rosa Martinez, and she had been with Horizon Airways for 22 years. Her entire body was shaking. She had watched promotion after promotion go to younger people with better demographics. She had told herself it was okay. She had told herself she didn't want the responsibility. She had told herself a lot of things that made the pain feel manageable. But now, standing in a first-class cabin where a CEO had just dismantled a discriminatory system and was now asking for her help, Rosa understood her wait was over. I'm Rosa Martinez, senior flight attendant certified as purser, she said, and something in her voice had changed. The defeated tone was gone. There was new steel in her voice. I'm ready to take command of the cabin, Rosa Keisha said, and something in her voice softened just slightly. You're now in charge. I need complete pre-flight safety checks. I want this aircraft buttoned up and ready for pushback in 10 minutes. Can you do that? Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but she straightened her spine. Yes, Ms. Morrison. Absolutely. I won't let you down, Rosa said, and she meant it. She meant every word. I know you won't, Keisha said simply. As Rosa turned to coordinate the rest of the cabin crew, you could see her entire body moving with new purpose. She had been waiting 22 years to be seen. She had been waiting 22 years for someone in authority to notice that she had integrity. She had been waiting 22 years for a chance to lead. and on MA 827 to New York, she finally got it. The other flight attendant snapped into action. The cabin came alive with a precision and purpose that Derek had never managed because Derek's crew had been focused on servicing the platinum passengers and treating everyone else as invisible. Meanwhile, Victoria Ashford was still sitting in her seat, her face a mask of shock and humiliation, and the beginning of understanding. Richard Ashford finally understood what was happening. He slowly removed his headphones. He looked at Keisha, and there was a moment of recognition that passed between them. Richard was a man who understood leverage. He understood power. And he understood in that moment that he was on the losing end of a deal he hadn't even known he was making. He stood up slowly and walked over to Keisha's seat. His voice was careful, calculated, the voice of a man trying not to make things worse. "Ms. Morrison," he said carefully, "I'm sure we can discuss this. My wife got carried away, but your wife violated federal law by interfering with flight crew operations." Keisha cut him off. "That's not a matter for discussion. That's a matter for documentation and consequences." Richard nodded slowly. He was starting to understand that this wasn't personal. It was professional. And professionals enforced rules. However, Keisha continued, "I am interested in whether you knew about her behavior. Did you tell her to demand another passenger move?" "No," Richard said firmly. "Absolutely not. Then you'll understand that your position on Horizon's board of directors is now under review, not because of her actions directly, but because someone on our board has been allowing a culture where this behavior is normalized. The board is supposed to set the culture. Instead, you've enabled the rot." Richard's face went pale. He sat back down slowly. Keisha pulled out her laptop and began to type. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet as the plane began to taxi away from the gate. By the time the wheels left the tarmac, Keisha had drafted the infrastructure for change. The 5-hour flight from Los Angeles to New York passed in a tense silence, broken only by the necessary sounds of service and routine operations. Keisha spent the entire time typing on her laptop. She wasn't watching a movie. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't trying to process what had happened. She was working with the focused intensity that everyone in the first-class cabin could see but couldn't quite understand. She was drafting the infrastructure for company-wide change. First, she outlined the True Horizon Initiative, a complete top-to-bottom retraining program for all 87,000 employees of Horizon Airways. Not a diversity training that felt performative. Not a seminar that people would forget by the time they got home. This would be mandatory, comprehensive, and built on a simple principle: service means seeing people. Every person. Not just the ones with the most money. Not just the ones with the right status. Every single person who boards one of her planes deserves to be treated with dignity. Second, she drafted a personal commendation for Ben Torres, the gate agent, who had been kind to an elderly couple and who Derek Walsh had snapped at. She made a note: candidate for corporate training and development. This man understands what service actually means. Third, she created a performance review for Rosa Martinez with a recommendation for immediate promotion to Director of In-Flight Service Standards. She wrote, "Rosa Martinez demonstrated leadership, integrity, and grace under extraordinary circumstances. She represents the values this company should have been embodying all along." Fourth, she sent a secure message to Frank Dempsey, head of Horizon's corporate security. "Frank, I need a full audit of Derek Walsh's 6-year record. Every complaint, every performance review, every incident, every manager who oversaw his rise. I suspect the rot goes deeper than one flight attendant. I suspect this is not an exception. I suspect this is the rule." Fifth, she sent another message: audit all crew members trained by Derek Walsh. Audit their customer interactions, document patterns of discriminatory behavior. I need to know how deep this goes. I need to know if this is widespread or if it's just a few bad actors. Sixth, she made a call to her executive team emergency board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Dallas headquarters. I need everyone present. Something has happened that requires immediate action. I'll explain in person. By the time the wheels touched down at JFK, Keisha had the blueprint for a company-wide transformation. She had documented everything. She had created the evidence. She had prepared for the fight that was coming. Victoria Ashford had spent the 5 hours staring out the window, her face burning with humiliation. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken to Richard. She had simply sat processing the fact that her entire identity had been destroyed in the span of 3 minutes. Her 7-star platinum status was gone. She had already received the notification on her phone, a cold official termination of her membership. Her frozen miles account was useless. All too. 1 million points accumulated over years of flying and spending money were locked and would eventually be forfeited. Her lifetime ban from Horizon Airways meant she would never board one of their flights again. And Horizon Airways was the airline she flew most frequently, the airline that had been her status symbol, the airline that had made her feel special. Without it, who was she? She looked at her reflection in the window and didn't recognize the woman looking back. She saw someone small and vulnerable, someone ordinary, someone who had built her entire life on being treated as special. And now that the treatment was gone, the person underneath was scared and hollow. Richard had spent the flight on his phone, his face getting darker with each conversation. He'd called his lawyers. They had explained the situation. They had explained that Keisha Morrison had documentation. They had explained that the video was being shared on social media. They had explained that the best course of action was probably to apologize and move forward without legal action. He'd called his board. They had explained the stakes. He'd called his partners. They had expressed concern. And he'd realized by the time the plane landed that this incident was going to cost him significantly. Ben Torres, the gate agent from LAX, was standing at the back of the first-class cabin. He had been called to help with the transition. He had watched an entire airline's culture shift in the span of 3 hours. He had watched a CEO dismantle corruption in real time. He had watched someone with actual power use it for justice instead of profit. He was thinking something he'd never thought before. Maybe there really are people in leadership who care. Maybe there really are people who understand that power is supposed to be used to protect people, not to hurt them. As the plane descended into New York airspace, Captain Ortega was already filling out incident reports. He would file the most extraordinary report of his 40-year career. He would document everything that had happened, and he would send it up the chain of command with a note that said simply, "Ms. Morrison was aboard as an audit passenger. What she witnessed will require immediate company-wide response." The chaos that was about to happen at Horizon Airways would dwarf anything in the company's history. As the wheels of MA-827 kissed the tarmac at JFK, Captain Ortega made an announcement that sent a chill through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be remaining on the tarmac briefly for a security matter. Please remain seated." Tension rippled through the cabin. Outside the windows, people could see police vehicles. 3 figures walking toward the jet bridge, with clear authority and purpose. One was Frank Dempsey, the feared head of Horizon's corporate security, a man who reported directly to the CEO. A man whose appearance on a flight meant something serious was about to happen. 2 were JFK Port Authority police officers. Keisha remained in her seat, composed and still. She pulled out her phone and made a single call. "It's done," she said simply. Then she hung up. The jet bridge connected. The cabin door opened. The 3 figures boarded, and the passengers who had been filming suddenly understood this wasn't just corporate drama. This was law enforcement. Frank Dempsey walked directly to seats 5C and 5D. His expression was grim. His voice was official. "Richard Ashford," he said, his voice flat and even. "Victoria Ashford." Richard stood immediately. Yes, I'm Richard. That's my wife. You are both being served with formal notices of trespass, Frank said, handing the documents to Richard. Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from all Horizon Airways flights and all partner properties for life. Victoria gasped. This is insane. The basis for this ban. Frank continued, his voice not unkind, but absolutely unmovable. Is harassment of another passenger and interference with flight crew operations. Both of these actions violate federal law. One of the police officers stepped forward. His expression was professional and cold. Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, you will gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. Any deviation from these instructions will result in arrest for trespassing. This is outrageous, Richard said, but his face had gone grey. He understood suddenly that he was about to be marched off a plane in front of hundreds of witnesses. You can walk off this plane or you can be carried off in handcuffs and charged, the officer said simply. Your choice. But you are leaving. Victoria and Richard gathered their bags. Richard's face was a mask of controlled fury. Victoria's was a mask of pure humiliation. They had to walk the entire length of the first-class cabin. Every passenger was standing or craning their neck to watch. Every phone was recording. Every moment was being captured and would eventually be seen by millions of people around the world. Victoria tried to maintain dignity, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her purse. As they passed Keisha's seat, Keisha made eye contact with Victoria for exactly 1 second. That second communicated everything I saw what you did. I understand who you are, and you did this to yourself. Victoria looked away first. The officers flanked them and escorted them down the jet bridge. The door closed behind them with finality. The cabin erupted into whispers. Keisha stood up and gathered her simple bag. She thanked Rosa and the crew. She specifically thanked Captain Ortega. She walked off the plane with her head high, but her expression unreadable. She was met by her executive car on the tarmac. She got in. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just sat in the back seat and stared out at the runway. The car pulled away from the gate. Behind her in the terminal, Richard and Victoria Ashford were being processed for the trespass notice. They were being escorted through the terminal by police. Other travelers recognized them from the videos that were already spreading on social media. Phones came out. Videos were recorded. The Platinum Queen, as Victoria had always thought of herself, was being marched through an airport in humiliation. The walk was only 200 meters. It felt like 2 miles. Derek Brody was in a windowless room at JFK Airport. It was beige and fluorescent and utterly suffocating. He had been sitting there for 4 hours. He had cycled through anger and panic and desperation and a failed attempt at self-defense that everyone in the room saw through immediately. The room contained 1 table, 3 chairs, 1 computer screen, 1 camera in the corner. The camera had been recording his entire breakdown for the last hour. Frank Dempsey entered with Jessica Rivera, the General Counsel of Horizon Airways. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s who had made a career out of making sure the company was protected from liability and that justice was actually served. She looked at Derek like he was a liability. This is a misunderstanding. Derek began. That passenger was... Sit down, Mr. Brody, Jessica said. We're going to review some footage. They pressed play on the computer. Derek watched himself on the screen. He heard his own voice. Ma'am, I'm not asking any more. As a representative of Horizon Airways, I am instructing you to move. He watched himself threaten a passenger over a seat assignment. He watched himself lie about operational necessity. He watched himself attempt to downgrade her as punishment. And then he watched the moment he realized he had chosen the wrong passenger. He watched his own face drain of color. He watched the moment his career ended. So Mr. Brody, Frank said quietly, Would you like to explain what we just watched? Derek's mouth was dry. His hands were shaking. I was just trying to provide customer service. You were trying to provide preferential service based on perceived wealth, Jessica said flatly. You were attempting to use your authority to intimidate a passenger into violating her rights for the comfort of another passenger. That's not. Before you knew who she was. Frank interrupted, leaning forward. Before she showed you the CEO pass, who was she to you? Derek's silence was the answer. She was nobody. She was cargo. She was someone he could treat however he wanted because she didn't matter in the hierarchy he had created in his mind. She was nobody, Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. Wasn't she? In your mind, she didn't matter. In your mind, you had the right to move her because she didn't have enough status to deserve your respect. Derek couldn't speak, couldn't move. Frank turned on the video again. This time it was close-up of Derek's face. Close-up of the moment he goes completely pale when Keisha Morrison's name is spoken. Close-up of the moment his career ends. Do you know who that woman was? Frank asked. Before you saw the ID card. No, Derek whispered. Keisha Morrison. Our CEO. The person who signs the paychecks for 87,000 employees. The person who owns this airline. You just attempted to forcibly remove her from her own aircraft because you didn't recognize her and she didn't match your perception of someone who mattered. Derek felt something break inside his chest. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. In 6 years at Horizon, Jessica continued, you've accumulated 12 formal complaints. 9 of them are for discriminatory behavior. You've been coached multiple times on appropriate passenger service. You've received warnings. But you were never formally disciplined because you had high ratings from platinum flyers who enjoyed your preferential treatment. Derek's mind was racing. I was just following the culture. I was just doing what I was taught. By whom? Frank asked. Who taught you to treat non-premium passengers differently? My manager Derek said desperately. Alan Pierce. He told us Alan Pierce is about to have his own problems to deal with, Frank said flatly. But your choices on that aircraft were your own. You had the authority to de-escalate. You chose to escalate. You had the training to treat all passengers with respect. You chose to discriminate. That's not the culture's fault. That's yours. Derek opened his mouth, but Frank continued. Do you understand what you did? Frank asked. Not just on the plane. In the bigger picture, Derek shook his head. Tears starting to stream down his face. Frank leaned back in his chair. His voice was quieter now, but heavier. You took a woman who was in her assigned seat and attempted to remove her based purely on her perceived status. You used your uniform not for safety or service, but to enforce a hierarchy based on wealth. You taught the other employees on that flight that discrimination was acceptable as long as the right people benefited. And most importantly, you did it to a woman of color attempting to put her in the back of the plane, and you did it without even questioning whether you were doing something wrong. Derek was openly crying now, his shoulders shaking. Watch this, Frank said, pressing play again. This time it was Derek's own face in the video. Derek watching himself. Derek seeing exactly who he had become. That's you, Frank said. That's you threatening a passenger. That's you defending status over dignity. That's you making a choice that destroyed your career. Not because you didn't know better, but because you didn't care enough to do better. Derek couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but cry. Your employment with Horizon Airways is terminated for cause effective immediately, Jessica said, sliding a termination document across the table. The reasons are gross misconduct, passenger discrimination, and violation of federal aviation regulations. We are forwarding this file to the FAA with a recommendation for permanent revocation of your flight attendant certification. No, Derek whispered. Please, no. Your certification is likely finished, Frank said. No major carrier will hire you after this. Your career in aviation is over. You're done. The officers who had been waiting outside escorted Derek out. He was walked through the terminal, past other employees who now knew what he had done. His face was on screens throughout the airport. His name was attached to discrimination. His career was finished before he fully comprehended that it had ended. He was escorted into a car and driven to a motel. He was given an envelope with his severance 3-month salary and healthcare continuation for 60 days. He was told not to contact any Horizon Airways employees. He was left alone. Derek sat on the bed of a motel room in Queens and realized that his entire identity had been built on something that didn't exist, on false power, on a uniform that he thought gave him permission to hurt people, on a system that rewarded him for discrimination as long as the right people benefited. He thought about Kelly Price sitting calmly in her seat, refusing to be bullied. He thought about her dignity in the face of his cruelty. He thought about how easily she could have fought back and chosen violence and instead had chosen to change the system. He understood finally that she was more powerful than he had ever been. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. the next morning at Horizon's Dallas headquarters. The boardroom was massive and quiet. Keisha sat at the head of the table in a sharp black dress. Her expression was not angry. It was worse than anger. It was disappointment mixed with controlled fury, mixed with the weight of responsibility. Marcus Thompson arrived expecting to conduct normal business. He was the board's senior member, a relic of the old guard who had been fighting Keisha's modernization efforts at every turn. He still didn't understand what this was about. Alan Pierce arrived expecting a promotion. He was the manager who had trained Derek Walsh and dozens of other flight attendants in the culture of prioritizing platinum passengers. He thought the emergency meeting was to reward him for running the most successful crew at JFK. Richard Ashford was called in from New York, his face pale and worried. He understood that his world was about to change. Keisha played the video for the entire board. Everyone watched Derek threaten a passenger. Everyone watched Keisha reveal herself as CEO. Everyone watched the moment the power dynamic shifted, and Derek's career ended in real time. The video was 8 minutes long. It felt like 8 hours. When the video finished, the boardroom was silent. "We have a culture of discrimination at Horizon Airways," Keisha said simply. "This is not isolated. This is widespread. And it begins at the crew level, but extends to management and the board." Marcus Thompson tried to defend himself. "This is one bad apple." "Is it?" Keisha interrupted, and her voice cut through his words like a blade. "One bad apple doesn't accumulate 12 complaints in 6 years without a manager protecting him. One bad apple doesn't learn that discrimination is rewarded behavior without a system teaching him that. This isn't one bad apple. This is a rotten barrel. And the rot starts here." She turned to Alan Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, you managed Derek Walsh for his entire tenure. You coached him multiple times on behavior but never formally disciplined him. Why, he was one of our top-rated attendants." Alan said. "His customer satisfaction scores. Satisfaction scores from platinum passengers who paid for preferential treatment." Keisha cut him off. "That's not excellence, Mr. Pierce. That's corruption. That's creating a system where some people matter more than others based on how much they've paid. You didn't manage Derek Walsh. You enabled him. You trained him. You protected him." She addressed the board. "Let me be very clear about what happened on that flight." A senior flight attendant attempted to remove a paying passenger from her assigned seat because he didn't recognize her status. He threatened her with federal charges. He attempted to humiliate her with a downgrade. And he did it because she was a woman of color in simple clothes who didn't match his perception of someone important. That woman was me. The words landed in the room like a bomb. Marcus Thompson's face went pale. Alan Pierce looked like he might be sick. The other board members exchanged looks of shock and understanding. I was conducting an undercover audit. Keisha continued. I wanted to understand the culture of my own company. I got my answer. I got a front-row seat to the exact discrimination and bias that our customers have been reporting. And I watched two people, a flight attendant and a passenger, enforce a hierarchy based on wealth that has no place in this company or any other. She looked directly at Marcus Thompson. You've been fighting my cultural reform efforts at every board meeting. You've called diversity training PR fluff. You've protected people like Alan Pierce because they maintained the status quo. And the status quo is rich people matter, poor people don't. White passengers get better service. Passengers of color get questioned and downgraded. And women, especially black women, get told they don't belong. That's not fair, Marcus protested. I never said. You didn't have to say it, Keisha said quietly. Your silence said it all. Your protection of this culture said it all. Your resistance to change said it all. She called for a vote of no confidence in Marcus Thompson's board seat. She explained the evidence. She played excerpts from Derek's debrief where he specifically mentioned that Marcus had protected people like Alan Pierce. She explained that the viral video had millions of views. She explained that inaction was no longer an option. One by one, hands went up. The vote was unanimous, 11-0. Marcus was not allowed to vote for himself. By noon, Marcus Thompson was escorted out of the building. By 1 p.m., Alan Pierce received his termination notice. Gross mismanagement. Fostering a discriminatory culture. Immediate removal. By 2 p.m., Keisha announced the True Horizon initiative to the full board. Every employee, all 87,000 of them, would undergo comprehensive retraining. Not performative, not surface level. Deep, meaningful mandatory training on service without discrimination. She announced Rosa Martinez's promotion to Director of In-Flight Service Standards. She announced Ben Torres's transfer to Corporate Training and Development. She announced the creation of a new C-suite position, Vice President of Culture and Compliance. The message was clear: we are changing. We are changing now. We are changing from the top down. Victoria Ashford arrived home to discover that her life had changed irrevocably. Her 7-star platinum status was officially terminated. All 2.1 million accumulated frequent flyer miles were frozen and would be forfeited. Her Elite credit card was deactivated. Her access to the Horizon Elite Lounge was revoked. She was banned from all properties. She called customer service and got a recording. Your call is important to us. Your account status permanently banned. She tried to book a flight on another airline to process what was happening. She needed to think. She needed to understand. She needed to escape. She booked a ticket on a budget carrier for a flight to Miami. It was the middle seat of the middle row. She was seated between a teenager with noise-cancelling headphones who spent the flight elbowing her constantly and a man who smelled like garlic and didn't apologize once. She tried to get a flight attendant to help her move to an empty exit row seat she could see from her position. The attendant checked the manifest. That's not your assigned seat, ma'am. I understand, but this seat next to me is very uncomfortable and your assigned seat is 14th F. That's where you need to sit. The flight attendant didn't recognize her. The flight attendant didn't know that Victoria had once commanded upgrades and special treatment. The flight attendant didn't care who Victoria was. The flight attendant treated her exactly like everyone else. It was the worst flight of her life. For someone whose entire identity was built on being treated as special, being treated as ordinary, was a kind of death. The death of a self that was based on status. The death of an identity that had no substance beneath it. When the divorce papers arrived 4 months later, Victoria signed them without argument. She had earned this. She understood finally that she had destroyed her marriage the moment she thought she was better than the woman sitting next to her. Richard Ashford sat in the back seat of an Uber from JFK to Manhattan. His phone had stopped ringing hours ago. That was worse than when it was ringing every second. He had called his lawyer. They had explained the lawsuit was unwinnable. He had called his partners. They had expressed concern. He had called the board. They had reminded him that they were reviewing his membership. But worse than all of that was the silence from his wife. Victoria hadn't spoken to him since they left the plane. She was sleeping in a separate room now. The marriage that had been built on her status as 7-star platinum was crumbling because that status no longer existed. Richard understood finally that he had spent 28 years supporting a woman who believed she was better than other people. He had enabled it. He had profited from it. He had never questioned it. He had never said the words, "Maybe this isn't right. Maybe we shouldn't treat people this way." He looked at his phone. News story: CEO dismantles airline discrimination. 47 million views. His wife was in that video. He was in that video. Their marriage was imploding in that video for the entire world to watch. Richard didn't feel angry. He felt something worse. He felt understood. The CEO had seen exactly what was happening on that flight and exactly what it meant. She had seen his wife's entitlement, his participation through silence, his role in a system that treated people differently based on wealth. And she had decided it was time for consequences. Richard wondered what his legacy would be. Not the business deals, not the private equity firm. This moment, this public dismantling of his own complicity in a corrupt system. By the time his Uber arrived in Manhattan, Richard had made a decision. He was going to vote yes on every diversity initiative. He was going to be a voice for change on the Horizon board. Not because he believed in it, but because he was terrified of being on the wrong side again. It would take him 5 years to actually start believing in it. But that was okay. Sometimes belief follows consequence. Sometimes people change because they have to, and then later they understand why they should have. 6 months after his termination from Horizon Airways, Derek Brody was working at a CVS pharmacy in New Jersey. Not because he needed the money. His severance package had been substantial. Not because he had any passion for retail. But because he needed something he couldn't find anywhere else: anonymity. Nobody at CVS knew he had been a flight attendant. Nobody knew he had threatened a passenger. Nobody knew he had helped dismantle an airline's culture through his own cruelty. He was just Derek, the guy who stocked shelves and said, "Have a good day" to customers who didn't care who he was. Some nights he scrolled through the viral video. He had watched it hundreds of times by now. He watched himself stand in a first-class cabin uniform, immaculate certainty radiating from his posture. He watched himself abuse a passenger because she didn't match his perception of importance. He watched a woman in jeans stand up and dismantle everything he thought he was. And slowly over months he started to understand, not just what he had done on that flight, but who he had become, and more importantly, who he could choose to become. He had chosen cruelty. He had chosen power over people. He had used his uniform like a weapon, and he had done it consistently over years because he had been rewarded for it. But what if he chose differently? One day an elderly woman came into CVS. She looked vaguely familiar. Derek tried to place her face. Then he remembered she was the woman whose boarding question he had heard Jennifer Walsh snap at in the LAX terminal. The elderly couple who had asked about boarding zones. She didn't recognize Derek. She just bought a newspaper and left. But Derek followed her to the parking lot. "Excuse me," he said. She turned confused. "I worked at Horizon Airways," Derek said. "I was a flight attendant. And I remember you. I remember someone snapping at you at the gate for asking a simple question." The woman's face froze. Recognition mixed with fear. "I just wanted to say..." Derek continued, his voice shaking. "That was wrong. I'm the one who should be apologizing now. I was part of a system that treated people like you as if you didn't matter. And I'm sorry." The woman stared at him for a long moment. "Thank you for that," she finally said. "But more importantly, thank you for standing here telling me instead of just living with what you did." She drove away, leaving Derek standing in the CVS parking lot, understanding something he had been working toward understanding for months. Redemption isn't about forgetting what you did. It's about changing what you're going to do. Derek was never going to be a flight attendant again. But maybe he could be something else. Maybe he could help other people understand what he had finally understood, that power is a choice, and the choice matters. Rosa Martinez had been a flight attendant for 22 years. She had watched promotion after promotion go to people younger than her people with different backgrounds. She had watched a woman with 3 years of experience become purser while she was passed over. She had watched the pattern happen again and again. One day she had sat in the crew lounge and looked at the promotion list. Her name wasn't on it. Again, she had gone home and called her mother. "Maybe it's time to let it go," her mother had said gently. "Maybe it's time to accept that this company doesn't see you the way you see yourself." Rosa had almost listened to her mother. She had almost decided to stop caring. She had almost convinced herself that the promotion didn't matter. She had almost given up. But then Keisha Morrison stood up in the first-class cabin and asked, "Who is the most senior flight attendant aboard?" And Rosa's hand went up before her mind could stop it. Ben Torres was 22 years old when Derek Walsh snapped at him for being kind to an elderly couple. He was going to quit that job. He had been thinking about it for weeks. The gate agent position paid poorly was treated as entry-level and had given him a front-row seat to how the airline industry treated people with less money and less status. But something had shifted inside him. He watched the elderly couple exchange nervous glances after Derek snapped at him. He watched them shrink back into themselves, suddenly unsure, suddenly worried that they had done something wrong by asking a simple question. And he felt something crystallize inside him. Not anger, understanding. Understanding that power could be used to hurt people. Understanding that the system was designed to do exactly that. Then he watched a CEO stand up against that system. And instead of quitting, Ben showed up the next day and did his job even better. He showed up and treated every passenger with dignity. He showed up and refused to participate in the hierarchy. Within 2 weeks, he was called into an office. He thought he was being fired for something. Instead, Keisha Morrison offered him a position in corporate training and development. She wanted him to teach flight crews how to see passengers as people. Not status points, just people. "You already know how to do it," she had said. "You did it today when Mr. Walsh was being cruel. You were still kind anyway. That's exactly what we need to teach." Now, 6 months later, Ben was traveling to airports across the country. Training gate agents, flight attendants, and customer service representatives on the True Horizon initiative. He was showing them videos of good service. He was showing them videos of bad service. He was asking them over and over, "Who are you in this video? Are you the person serving with dignity or the person serving with status?" Every day he thought about the moment Derek Walsh had snapped at him. Every day he chose to be the opposite of that. Every day he helped other people make the same choice. The other passengers on MA 827 became accidental advocates for corporate accountability. David Martinez, the attorney who filmed everything, posted the video without asking permission. Within weeks, it had 47 million views. He started a podcast called Power and Justice, where he analyzed moments when authority was used for good and moments when it was used for harm. He interviewed Keisha Morrison. He interviewed Rosa Martinez. He interviewed Ben Torres. And through his platform, millions of people around the world understood a simple truth. Accountability matters. Justice is possible. And sometimes all it takes is one person with power choosing to do the right thing. Susan Lee, the teacher who had taken her family's once-in-a-lifetime first-class flight, brought the video into her classroom. She asked her students repeatedly, "What does power look like when it's used for justice? What does power look like when it's used for harm? Which person in this video are you going to be?" Her students are still discussing it. The video has become required viewing in her school. Students understand that power is a choice. That authority can be used for good. That one moment of standing up can change everything. Thomas and Martha Gonzalez, the elderly couple who had been snapped at in the terminal, had their boarding question answered kindly by Ben Torres. They flew in first class and watched everything unfold. They wrote Horizon Airways a letter not about the incident itself, but about what the incident meant. "Thank you for having a CEO who cares enough to fix things," they wrote. "Thank you for showing us that there are still people in power who see us." Their granddaughter posted the letter on social media. It received 2 million shares. That night, Keisha was in her office at Horizon's Dallas headquarters. It was 11 p.m. Everyone else had gone home. The building was empty except for the security guards who nodded to her as she passed. She sat in her father's chair. She had kept all of his furniture in her office when she became CEO. His mahogany desk, his leather chair, his bookshelf filled with books about aviation and business and philosophy. The chair was worn from decades of use. It was comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with softness. She looked at her computer screen. The viral video had 47 million views. It was trending on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, every platform. News outlets around the world had covered it. Business schools had added it to their curricula. It had become the most watched moment of corporate accountability in recent history. The headline on every screen read, "Whose undercover dismantles discriminatory airline crew live." She watched it again. She watched herself transform from weary professor to CEO. She watched Derek's face go white. She watched Victoria's smugness turn to humiliation. She watched the other passengers' faces shift from shock to validation to belief that maybe, just maybe, justice exists. Then Keisha put her head in her hands. Her hands were shaking, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, with rage. Pure, trembling rage that she had been holding back because CEOs don't shake. CEOs don't cry. CEOs don't let the world see that being told to move, being dismissed, being treated like you don't belong in your own seat on your own airline, that it had hurt. Because for one moment on that flight before she revealed herself, she wasn't a CEO. She was just a woman. A woman in jeans who someone decided didn't matter. A woman of color who someone decided was worth less than someone else. A woman who was told that her space, her seat, her right to be treated with dignity was negotiable. And yes, she had power to punish that. Yes, she had authority to change it. But that didn't erase the fact that it had happened, that it was happening to other women every single day on flights across the world, that her own airline was teaching people, teaching them that power and wealth determined your worth. Her father had built this airline on dignity, on the belief that everyone mattered, on the understanding that a person's value wasn't determined by their status or their wealth. And she had let it become a place where some people mattered more than others. The weight of that responsibility crashed down on her shoulders, and Keisha Morrison, CEO of Horizon Airways, the woman who had just dismantled a discriminatory system in front of hundreds of witnesses, and millions of people watching online, sat alone in her father's chair and cried. Not for Derek or Victoria or Marcus or Alan. For everyone who had been made to feel small by a system that should have made them feel safe. For everyone who had been told they didn't belong. For everyone who had internalized the message that their worth was less than someone else's. She cried for the first-time flyers who were nervous about flying and who experienced coldness instead of kindness. She cried for the passengers of color who were questioned more intensely than white passengers. She cried for the elderly people who asked simple questions and were snapped at for inconveniencing people with power. She cried for the culture she had allowed to develop in her own company. When she finally looked up, her face was wet, but her eyes were clear. She opened her laptop and got back to work. The video went viral globally within 48 hours. Media outlets around the world covered the story not as CEO shames flight attendant, but as CEO dismantles discrimination in real time. NPR ran a story when power is used for justice. The Keisha Morrison moment. The BBC covered it. American CEO takes action against airline discrimination. Business schools added it to their ethics curricula. Professors asked their students, "What would you have done? How would you have handled this differently? What does accountability look like?" Thousands of messages poured into Horizon Airways customer service lines. Not angry messages, messages of gratitude. "Thank you for standing up. I've never been treated fairly at an airline either." Finally, someone with power cares. The stock price rose 18% in the first week. Customer satisfaction scores started climbing. Complaints about discriminatory treatment dropped 89% within 3 months. 3 managers who had been protecting discriminatory crew members were terminated. 12 crew members stepped forward with their own stories of retaliation for reporting discrimination. Horizon established a new internal reporting system with real protections and real consequences. By the end of the fiscal quarter, Horizon Airways stock was at an all-time high. But Keisha measured success differently than the market did. She measured it by emails from first-time flyers. "I felt safe on your airline. I felt respected." She measured it by testimonials from employees. "I finally feel like my company stands for something." She measured it by customer reviews that mentioned kindness, not luxury, not status perks. Kindness. The True Horizon initiative was completed by all 87,000 employees within 6 months. Training wasn't perfunctory. It wasn't a box to check. It was mandatory, comprehensive, and built on the principle that service means seeing people. Every person, not just the ones with money. Every single person who boards one of her planes deserves to be treated with dignity. By the end of the year, Horizon Airways had become a case study in how corporations could actually create real change instead of just talking about it. Keisha Morrison boarded a flight from LAX to New York 1 year after the incident. This time, she was flying as Keisha Morrison, CEO. No disguise, no incognito audit. Just her in her simple jeans in first-class seat 5A. Her favorite seat. A flight attendant approached. She was one of Rosa's new hires, trained in the True Horizon initiative, educated in the philosophy that all passengers deserve respect. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Morrison. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage?" "Water, please," Keisha said. The flight attendant moved to the man in 5B. He was a Hispanic businessman in a wrinkled shirt, not dressed expensively, not a status indicator anywhere on him. The flight attendant offered him the exact same service, so welcome aboard. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage? Champagne water, orange juice." Same smile, same tone, same respect. Keisha watched this small moment. One man was being treated with the same dignity as the CEO. The system was working. The culture was changing. The flight attendant returned with Keisha's water. "Please let me know if there's anything I can do for you, Ms. Morrison. My job is to ensure your safety and comfort." Keisha looked at her name tag, Rosa. Different Rosa than the director, but trained by her, carrying her values forward. Keisha raised her glass to the window, to the new horizon. She sipped her water and watched the plane push back from the gate. She watched the powerful, clean ascent she had always loved. The physics of it, the elegance. the impossible made possible. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Keisha thought about her father. She thought about what he would say if he could see his airline now. Not perfect, but trying. Not corrupt, but changing. She thought he'd be proud. Derek Brody eventually left the CVS and enrolled in community college, a 28-year-old man sitting next to 18-year-olds who didn't know he used to threaten passengers for a living. The professor was lecturing about power dynamics. Derek found himself thinking about MA 827. By the end of the semester, he understood that he wasn't studying sociology to find redemption. He was studying it to understand how he had become so small that he needed a uniform to feel important. 5 years later, he was working as a counselor for at-risk youth in New Jersey. He had a small office. He made half what he used to make as a flight attendant. He was happier. He never flew again. He didn't need to. But he told his students over and over, power is dangerous. The uniform I wore gave me permission to hurt people. I took that permission, and it took losing everything to understand what I'd done. His students listened. Some learned, some didn't. Derek continued anyway, because he understood that helping one person was worth the effort, even if it meant starting with himself. Victoria Ashford had found peace in anonymity. She had moved to Arizona and changed her name to Vicky Ashton. She had found a job as an administrative assistant in a medical office. She made a modest living. She flew coach when she had to fly. People didn't recognize her anymore. Nobody asked her about her status, or her miles, or her platinum membership. It took her 3 years to understand that this was actually freedom. She never contacted Horizon Airways again. She never tried to fight the ban. She simply let go of the woman she had been. And slowly, in the quiet of her new life, she built someone new, someone with a smaller identity, but a more real one. Richard Ashford remained on Horizon's board, but as a minority voice in the vote. He voted yes on every diversity initiative. He donated to organizations fighting discrimination. His colleagues assumed it was ethics. It was actually fear, but the effect was the same. By the end of 10 years, Richard had genuinely changed his mind. He had come to believe in diversity, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Sometimes belief follows consequence. Sometimes people change because they have to, and then later they understand why they should have. Richard was an example of both. Rosa Martinez had been waiting 22 years. On MA 827, she finally got her moment. She became Director of In-Flight Service Standards and led the True Horizon Initiative training for all 87,000 employees. She never forgot the day a CEO asked her if she was ready to lead. She always said yes to that question. Ben Torres traveled to airports across the country teaching flight crews about dignity. He remembered the moment Derek Walsh snapped at him, and every day he chose to be different. Every day he taught others to choose differently. The video of Keisha Morrison's reveal remained one of the most watched moments in corporate history. It was referenced in business schools. It was shown in diversity trainings worldwide. Every time someone watched it, they saw the same thing: power used for justice. Keisha Morrison remained CEO of Horizon Airways. She never removed the video from the internet. She let it teach. She let it inspire. She let it show the world that real change was possible. 17 years after that flight, when Keisha finally retired, her successor was someone trained in the True Horizon Initiative. Someone who believed that service means seeing people. Keisha stepped down quietly. She had coffee with Rosa Martinez. They laughed about that flight. Rosa said, "You changed everything that day." And Keisha said, "We changed everything. You just stepped forward when it mattered." And that is how one flight and one woman's refusal to be bullied changed an entire airline, and how that airline became a model for corporate accountability around the world, and how millions of people learned that power is a choice, and that the choice matters. Sometimes all it takes is one person with power choosing to do the right thing, and one person with integrity stepping forward to help. And suddenly a whole system changes. One passenger at a time, one moment of dignity at a time, one refusal to accept that the world has to work this way. That's how real change happens. Now, if this story moved you, if it reminded you that real accountability is possible, if it showed you that standing up for what's right actually matters, I need you to do something for me. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to see that power can be used for justice. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one. Stories that remind us what real justice looks like. And in the comments below, tell me, if you had been on that flight, would you have filmed it? Would you have spoken up? Would you have done what was right? The world is watching. The world is listening. And the world is ready for people who will choose to do the right thing. Be one of those people.